Good evening, everyone. So you might be sitting there thinking, well, I'm not stuck, so what do I need to hear this? But when you saw in the previous example, the journey, we pass through life, and at every moment in our life, we have the opportunity to be stuck or to be unstuck. And it's interesting because if we think about how we want to move ahead in our lives, we're going to hit these roadblocks and get stuck. And then it's that moment of how we get beyond that. And I think that what we do is we stumble through life often and do this non-strategically. We find our way forward almost by accident, by trial and error or whatever. But what if when we face into challenges in our life, we were able to do this in a more strategic way? To really understand what gets us stuck and how to get unstuck when that actually happens. So this is the basis of my book, Getting Unstuck, a strategic approach to creating the life that you want. So the truth is we all get stuck. And the picture here is just of a bicycle. And it's to remind us that at some time in our lives, no one in this room could ride a bicycle. But we learned. And so you imagine the kid who's learning to ride a bike and they're stuck. They can't do it. They can't balance. They can't pedal. They can't get the coordination right. They fall off. They graze their knee. They try and they try and they try. No matter how much they want to ride the bike, they haven't developed the competency to be able to do that. So they're stuck. Now here's the thing, if we stand on this side of the learning and we say, I can't ride a bike, oh, it's all too much and I give up, I'll never be able to ride the bike. But then something happens, there's that 1 second of learning. And on the other side of that learning, I'm now the kid who can ride the bike. And what I do is I don't think about that stuff about before, about I couldn't ride a bike before, I'm now the kid who can ride a bike. And now I move on to the next challenge, which is how do I ride the bike on rough surfaces? Or how do I use the brakes? Or how do I ride with my mates down a big hill? How do I go really fast? Or how do I jump? Or whatever my next challenges are going to be, but I've moved on from this stuckness to something else. And when you think about it, our life is a journey of learning. We start off not being able to do anything. So like you couldn't write. You couldn't write P, B or Q. You couldn't separate those things. You couldn't speak. You couldn't even feed yourself. And yet you can all do that without even thinking now, and you moved on to much bigger challenges. So if you think about your life, you might be stuck in places that are really obvious, like it might be your career, it might be your relationship, it might be your behaviours and habits. It could be somewhere like that, or it could be a lot of stuff you're doing, you're not even realising that you're stuck, because you're doing stuff unconsciously without even realising that you're holding yourself back. Now, my story is I came out of uni with a science degree. And after a number of years, I ended up running a rather large business overseas. I was responsible for 1.2 billion euros in sales. And I covered basically in a global job. And the whole time, from the bottom to the top, I was stuck. I just didn't know it. So it's interesting when we allow ourselves to reflect upon ourselves, the ways in which we get stuck, even though we might think we're successful. And what's really interesting is we all get stuck in different ways. Now, my journey to write the book was fascinating because what happened was I was speaking at an international conference and someone came up and said, you must read my book, it's the answer. So I took his book and I started to read it, threw it aside, no, I'll try it again, no, this is rubbish, and I threw it in the recycling. Because what he wrote, if I used that with any of my clients, it would only get them stuck even more. And I thought about it, and I thought, well, there has to be a way for us to move people on from being stuck without a prescriptive method. Because what we do is if we buy a book that simply says, stop this and start doing this, or you must do this, or you must do that, well, that's going to work for a small percentage of the population, but not for everybody. So how do we actually trust that everybody is a unique colour? I know there's some people from Dulux here, so hopefully that's the right brand paint for you. But everybody is unique. Everybody comes from a different place. Everybody's got different history, different experiences, different learnings, different understandings. So we're all different. So if I said to one person, you must do this, it might be right for them, but it's not going to be right for somebody else. So how do we help people have that learning experience to shift beyond where they're stuck in their own way? Because a person might be stuck in their career. They might be stuck in wanting to be a better leader and not know how to do it. They might be stuck in a relationship scenario. They might be stuck in a personal scenario with bad habits, Maybe they've got something like depression or anxiety or something like that they're stuck in. Everybody gets stuck in so many different ways. And to be prescriptive about how to get people unstuck, it will only work for a small percentage of the population. There's got to be a better way. And I love this expression from Benjamin Franklin: teach me and I forget, or tell me and I forget. Teach me and I remember. Involve me and I learn. So when you tell people you should do this, when you teach them, you get a bit further. But when you actually engage them and involve them in the learning process, then they're going to get unstuck and move forward. Because until I actually have that experiential learning moment, that riding the bike moment, that aha, it happened, then there's that 1 second of learning and I get on the other side of it and I'm unstuck. And then I'll stay unstuck until I reach my next challenge, whatever that is. But if we're generous in our approach to ourselves and we say, I'm only unstuck because there's something I haven't learned, imagine the possibilities that opens up for you now. Because if I'm stuck because I'm no good, if I'm stuck because I'm useless, if I'm stuck because that was something that happened to me, my dad did it to me when I was a kid, then how do I ever get out of that? But when I actually say, regardless of where I start, regardless of what my story is, I'm only stuck because there's something I haven't learned. And when you take that approach to yourself, it's really generous and it creates a space for you to move forward. It doesn't hold you back, it doesn't limit you. And I think there's real power in that. And if you can accept that as the first truth about yourself, that you're only stuck because there's something you haven't learned, imagine the space of opportunity that opens up in front of you. And when you think about where we're stuck in our lives, we can really be stuck in 3 places. The first is with our goals. When we set ourselves goals which we want to achieve, that we either can't achieve or because circumstances get in the way, we don't manage to do it. So we might want to be the boss. We might want to be, the leader of the company, the CEO or whatever. But how specifically do you know that you're exactly the right person for that job? I mean, you go for an interview and there's 3 people sitting on a panel. Exactly how much of your performance is based upon what you do and what the people think on the panel? I remember my son went for an audition because he likes music, he sings and stuff like that. And he sung beautifully, came out. I said, how'd you go in your audition? He said, brilliant, I went really well. Fantastic, he didn't get the role. We went along and watched the show. And my son's got blue eyes and blonde hair. And we walked in and the 3 people that were supposed to be his brothers all had olive complexion and dark hair. And I said, you could have sung like an angel, mate. You were never going to get that role. Because you did the best that you could, but actually they were looking for something specific. So if you beat yourself up about, I didn't get the role, isn't that the wrong way to look at it? Isn't there actually a factor of, this was my goal, but there's a whole lot of circumstance that sits around it? And what we do when we set our goals is we often don't ask ourselves, is it actually possible? Because if I wanted to jump off the roof and fly without wings, it's not going to work. I actually have to make sure that it is possible. And we get into this satisfaction equation problem, because if you think about it, satisfaction equals perception minus expectation. So if I expect to get the job and I don't, then I'm going to be dissatisfied. And this is the problem with customer delight, because what we do is we say we want the customer to be so satisfied that we're going to delight them. The problem is that keeps building expectation. And unless we can keep building the perception about how wonderful the experience is going to be, we're going to get to the point where they're dissatisfied. And when you hear people say, I'm really dissatisfied with this, what happened in my life, then we can ask the question, is it because of what they perceive happened to them? Or is it about the expectation they set beforehand? Because when these aren't aligned, then there's no way they can be satisfied. And the problem with perception and expectation is there's a whole lot of circumstance that sits behind it. Because what am I in control of? It's one of the toughest questions. You ask people, what are you in control of? And a lot of people say, I don't know. Or they'll say everything. And the answer is you're only in control of your response. In any moment, your only responsibility is your ability to respond. You can't change circumstance. Like this evening, we knew it was going to be a cool evening, so a lot of people bought jackets. Okay, the room warms up, we take our jackets off, we respond to the circumstance. We can't control the weather, but we respond to it. You can't control circumstance, but what you control in any moment is how you choose to respond. And what we often do is unconsciously we choose really bad responses out of habit, and it gets us stuck over and over again. And then we get into this thing of being dissatisfied. So when we think about it, the first place we get stuck is when we set really bad goals for ourselves. Or we don't fine-tune our goals with reality. We need to run ourselves over with the reality bus occasionally, and that improves the quality of our goals. How specifically do you know that you can achieve that goal? How specifically do you know that you're in control of what will deliver that outcome? And how much of it is due to circumstance? And when it's due to circumstance, how are you going to choose to respond when it doesn't go your way? They're really valuable questions to be asking yourself as you set goals. Then the next thing is behaviours. Because what we do is we behave in certain ways under certain circumstances. We learn. We're like a rat in a maze, one of Skinner's pigeons. Right? We're trained. We get rewarded and we act more like this. We get punished. We act less like it. We're really simple creatures. The truth is that our behaviours are learned patterns. And we behave the same way over and over because that's the way we've learned to do it. And to actually change a behaviour can actually be quite tough. But what's true is that if you want to see a behaviour, you need more than just the learning. Because, I've got to go this way. Yes. Because any behavioural outcome you want is based upon three factors. Here's an example. You say to me right now, Phil, juggle. I go, great, I'll juggle for you. So I've got my 3 pens, and I go, actually, I can't be stuffed. If I'm not motivated, you're not going to see juggling. You could say, Phil, juggle, I've got my pens. I've got no skill, they end up on the floor. Without the skills, you're not going to see the outcome. Or you could say to me, Phil, juggle. And I go, I've got nothing to juggle. There's no infrastructure. So any time you're expecting someone to deliver a behaviour, if you're a leader and you're asking someone on your team to deliver a behaviour, first of all check, is the motivation present? Do they have the skills? And have you provided them with the infrastructure so they can actually deliver the behaviour that you want? Too often I see people asking for behaviours without checking whether any of these things actually exist. They're not motivated. They don't have the skill. We haven't trained them. We haven't taught them. Or we haven't given them the infrastructure they need to actually deliver on that. So it's fascinating when you ask yourself for a behaviour to be able to get unstuck, to be able to move beyond your boundary, or you're trying to help someone in your team get unstuck and move across their next boundary. Can they actually do it? It's really interesting. And the third place we get stuck is what I call a conditional field. And Milton Erickson referred to our unconscious as a vast storehouse of everything we've learned, all of our beliefs, all of our learnings, all of our history. And for me, the conditional field, it's the field of your unconscious that sets the conditions on the behaviours that you will exhibit. So for example, my identity, how I see myself relative to the group. If I don't think that I'm of a level where I should be the boss or I could speak up, then I'm not going to. It's going to limit my behaviours. If I label myself in a certain way, if I see myself as I've got to be the critic, or I've got to be I've got to be the tough guy, that label is going to select behaviours in and select behaviours out. Now, I might not be consciously doing it, but because I've given myself that label at some point, imagine how it shapes my behaviours. My identity, how I see myself relative to other people. What about the idea of your critical voice? If I ask people to put their hands up, and I won't do that, that's not the sort of presentation that it is, but if you've got a critical voice, most hands would go up in the room. And your critical voice is the older version of you trying to keep you safe. It forgets that you've moved beyond where that critical voice spoke from and you've got new fresh goals in front of you. It doesn't handle novelty well. So all of these elements, all these unconscious elements that you can address actually will stop you moving ahead if you're not thinking about, when I'm getting stuck, is it at my goal level? Is it my behaviours? Or is it those unconscious things which actually drive my behaviours? And if we think about it in that sort of pyramidal structure, a lot of the stuff that gets us stuck is actually the stuff that's behind the scenes. It's that unconscious thinking. And when you allow yourself to take the time to decode that and actually sit with it, you'll be surprised how much of it you can open up and how much of it is actually open to re-scripting. Just because you've called yourself something doesn't mean you've got to keep calling yourself that thing. Because remember, if you're generous, you're only stuck because there's something you haven't learned. There's something you haven't applied to yourself in a way which will allow you to move forward. And self-awareness is only the first step. Because I can know, you see people and they do something and they go, oh, damn it, I told myself I shouldn't do that. Oh, no, I did that again. They're aware that they're doing it, but they're not doing anything with it. The path to being unstuck goes through the process of starting with self-awareness. I'm aware I'm stuck. I'm feeling frustrated. This behaviour isn't working for me. This goal isn't working for me. My identity here is getting me stuck. Whatever it is, something is coming up and I'm being self-aware. But that's not enough. Because once I'm self-aware, I then have to shift to self-management. I have to manage myself. So I have to set aside the fact that I've been stuck and I have to decide how I'm going to respond. I have to manage myself. And then, once I do that enough times, I have a learned process where I then become master. I have self-mastery in that moment. So when that thing occurs, I then have mastery of my response. And then I can step forward and be unstuck. Because a lot of the time, we go to presentations, go to courses, and it's all about, well, we need this self-awareness stuff. But all we do is open up a big can of worms and don't do anything with the worms. The trick is when you're aware of something, you then have to take the responsibility of choosing your response. Because that's all you can ever do. As soon as you're aware, it's then your responsibility to choose your response. That's the key to getting unstuck. If all you do is sit there and go, oh, I'm really terrible because I do this all the time, well, then your response is poor. But the moment you go, I'm aware I'm doing this, now I'm going to do something different, I'm going to respond differently when that happens, imagine the potential for learning that you have, the path forward that you can create. And the longest journey begins with the smallest step, and the longest journey is your life. We are continuously progressing through stuck moments and unstuck moments our whole life. We're progressing. And right down here, the longest journey, the first step is courage. And the idea of emotional reasoning is so important because courage is such a cool concept because you hear it all the time about people in the military or people who've been through terrible situations. But for me, I see courage every day because the moment you set aside your feeling and you choose to respond with a positive action, that's courage. The definition is feel the fear and take the action anyway. That for me is a definition of courage. So you imagine somebody with severe depression getting out of bed and going to the letterbox takes courage. Someone with severe anxiety actually leaving the house and going into a shopping centre. How much courage does that take? Because imagine the sense of feeling that they have. And yet they set that aside and they take an action and they move themselves forward. So think about it in the workplace when you feel frustrated, when you feel scared, when you feel angry, when you feel out of control. When all of these feelings come up, if you're driven by your feeling, you're only going to get more stuck. But when you can say, this is what I feel, and I can choose my response, the outcome you get is completely different. Because each time you choose to take an action, you move yourself away from where you were stuck before. I choose my response. I choose my action, regardless of how I feel. The perfect example is road rage. If I'm driving along, someone cuts me off, and I feel frustrated, and I act out of that frustration. I'm going to chase them off the freeway, we're going to get in a fist fight, I'm going to get arrested and go to jail. Okay? If that's me reacting from my feelings. However, I'm driving along, someone cuts me off, I get frustrated, and I stay in my lane. I stay on the speed limit, and I keep going. I get to my goal. I get to where I'm going. because I've set aside the feeling and I've concentrated on the actions which are goal-directed to where I want to go. And that's the difference. One gives me a really bad outcome, and the other one, I move on. And here's the thing, the idiot that cut you off, 30 seconds later, I've forgotten about him. I'm singing along on the radio or listening to something else or doing something different. But when I stay in that frustration, the frustration just builds and builds and builds and feels terrible. All I do is I just amplify the feelings. So take courage. Feel the fear, feel the anger, feel the stuckness, whatever it is, and choose your best action, that single response which moves you forward. And when you're a leader and you can demonstrate courage, and you encourage other people to do exactly the same, the authenticity about demonstrating that you're feeling something but choosing an action anyway, imagine how far you can lead people through a learning curve. Imagine how all of a sudden we're building agility into the way that we work because we don't get stuck in the old stuff. We don't live in the old culture, but we're taking actions which are goal-directed and positive at every time. As the thing about agility is this is our life. I've got no idea what I'm doing. I don't have a manual for how I live. I don't have a manual for how to react to people, to have relationships, to be a leader. At every moment, I'm facing into a new moment of novelty, even standing here tonight. It's novel. I've never stood in this place with you before. So I've got no idea what I'm doing. But what I have to do is I have to trust that I've built up a series of skills and capabilities which will allow me to respond to this circumstance in that novelty in a way that allows me to move forward. Because it's not about how I feel. It's not about that I've never done it before. It's simply the fact that I think about what is the next smallest action I can take. You come to some conferences and they say, oh, let's write big, hairy, audacious goals or something. Let's write these massive goals that we need to do. And everyone writes down, I want to be a millionaire by next Tuesday. I want to be Bill Gates. Great, good luck with that. But here's the thing. The goal that you're left with, you go home and you go, well, I can't do that. I should be able to do it. I end up feeling worse about myself. Instead, ask yourself, where do I want to get to? Refine what that is for you and then say, what's the next smallest action I can take? How do I respond to that next circumstance? How do I own my own stuff? How do I control what I can control? How do I learn what I need to learn? So this moment becomes that moment. And I've moved forward. And then we've got the story of life, because life is about experimentation. The whole thing, the world's getting very excited about the idea of agility, about agile work processes. And agility is simply about experimentation. It's about that level of trust that I'm going to try something. I'm going to try a small action, see what happens. If it fails, that's cool. Because I realise that I've learned something from that experiment, I can do another experiment. And I saw a really interesting article that compared Tiger Woods to Roger Federer. And, so Tiger Woods, when he was 2 years old, his dad put a golf club in his hand. All he did, all his life, was swing a golf club. Roger Federer's mum was a tennis coach. She never coached him in tennis. She had him out playing lacrosse and skiing and doing all sorts of things. And it makes me wonder, are you better off doing 10,000 hours or 10,000 experiments? Are you a more rounded leader because you've done 10,000 hours of one thing? What if that's not your thing? What if you get to 18 and you go, well, I wish my dad had never put a golf club in my hand? Or you've done 10,000 experiments and you say, you know what, I really love it, I want to do that. Or I want to do this. Or we do a bit of this combined with that and we get this. And I build skills and capability and I learn and I try and I expose myself to new things. Imagine what that could look like. So it's interesting, the whole idea that we get stuck. Because that is just a cue for telling you that you're on life's journey. And if you have the generosity to say, I can get unstuck simply by understanding that there's something I need to learn. I need to respond differently. I need to think about things in a different way that will allow me just to move forward. That if I experiment and be agile in my own life, that I'm on this journey and it all begins with the next smallest step. So wherever it is that you're stuck now, or wherever it is that you get stuck as you move forward, allow yourself just to see yourself with generosity, number one. Think about, what is it that I need to learn? Or what is it that I need to refine about what I'm doing to actually have a really good goal that I can work towards? And then do it. Act. Regardless of how you feel, take the action that's going to move you forward anyway. And then you have a strategic approach to creating the life that you want. Happy to take questions, but that's the end of the presentation. Thank you. Okay.